Good morning, good morning, good morning. Echo Bucks, a much better investment than cryptocurrencies. Just want you to all to know that. If I'm too loud, someone will figure out how to turn me down, but I'm probably a little too, I'll try to talk softly. I get excited, so I won't always talk softly. I'm wearing a scruffy, kind of aged, disgusting kind of polo shirt that I'm wearing here, but this is the very first piece of Echo swag that we ever created, 1984, 38 years ago. It kind of fits, it's a little snug, but I thought this was an appropriate, thank you, an appropriate session for me to wear this at. Because what I'm going to talk about is my personal 50-year, they want me to stand here, that won't work, but I'll start here. The 50-year history that I have to talk about behavioral health care. It's going to be very personalized, which means it won't be accurate, it won't be complete, but it does represent the fact that I've had the opportunity over the past 50 years, including the last 40 with Echo, to visit 48 of the 50 states and to be involved in and see the operations of behavioral health care organizations in those 48 states. Just so you know, Hawaii and Idaho were my two failures. I'm not done, and so it might still work out that I'll be able to visit there. The 50-year aspect of it comes from the fact that I graduated from college in 1972. Hard to believe they even had colleges in 1972, but they did. I graduated with an equal number of credits in math and psychology. I even had a little bit of computer stuff. Dartmouth is where the programming language BASIC was invented by the president of the college, not while he was president, but a few years earlier. And I got to learn how to do a little bit of computer programming, which kind of led into this whole thing. The 1972 graduation left me with a need for a job, and I became a math teacher and basketball coach and ultimately union president in a small school district in Conway, New Hampshire. I've been there ever since I graduated from college, and that's where Echo was started. The classrooms that I had, the math department rooms, were on one end of the building, and on the far end of that hall was a single classroom with a single teacher and 15 students, and that was the special ed department and special ed program in the school. That was the only special education in a school of 800 kids. There were 15 kids assigned to that classroom and to that teacher. Other kids were in our classes. So I had a couple of kids who clearly had intellectual disabilities. At least a couple of them were living with fetal alcohol syndrome. And in retrospect, it was clear that was the case. The environment was poor, rural, and it was a tourism economy, and that was what that whole community was based on at that time. There was no technology industry at all in Conway, New Hampshire. As a teacher, you made interesting decisions. Today, teachers don't call home sometimes because they don't want parents yelling at them for abusing and picking on their kids and not doing enough for their kids. I didn't call some homes because I knew the child was likely to be beaten by the parents. There was no training because there was no real existence of any child protective services. So child and family services was virtually non-existent. There were a couple of orphanages in New Hampshire, but nothing that you would recognize today as a child protective services. I didn't know much about what was happening in mental health in the area 50 years ago. I knew that suicide was pretty frequent. I knew that in terms of substance abuse, that alcoholism was rampant. Every year or two in a high school of 800 kids, every year or two, for years, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 kids would die in single car accidents. Alcoholism and simply binge drinking was a large part of life at that point in time. law, 94-142 passed. That was the first special education law in 1975. Nothing resulted from that during the time I was teaching. I taught for 6 years. During that time, though, I went back to school and wound up getting an MBA, and I started my master's degree in counseling. And I had the opportunity to be an assistant superintendent of schools at 28, and I was going to be the superintendent at 30, and then I met the school board, and I didn't do that. And so I wound up first providing advice as a consultant to Northern New Hampshire Mental Health and Developmental Services, and then became and was offered and accepted the position as deputy director of that agency, Northern New Hampshire Mental Health and Developmental Services. It was just a few blocks away from where the high school was. My wife and I had our second child 2 weeks after I started that job. She was born without any blood in her. During labor, her blood was cut off, and therefore no blood, no oxygen going to her brain. And so she went on an airplane, not a helicopter, an airplane to Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital, and was in the NICU there for a couple of weeks and came out, and no follow-up services, nothing else was really available to her. Some people advised us to put her into the Laconia State School, which was the developmental disabilities organization that served all of New Hampshire and was what you might have expected of what those organizations were like at that time. The services that we got were basically a function of my wife's nursing background and her persistence with a couple of physical and speech therapists in the area, and she started to get some services. Every 6 months, Dartmouth would invite us over to have her evaluated, and when she was 2 years old, they still couldn't tell us whether she'd ever speak or walk or anything. And ultimately, she graduated from Colby Sawyer College, a small college in New Hampshire. She ran on the track team. She was pretty slow, but she ran on the track team, and she lives independently now, and she works for a program that supports individuals with more serious disabilities than the ones that she has. But a constant battle for her to receive the kind of services that she needed with the cerebral palsy, which is the sort of catch-all definition that she had. Northern New Hampshire Mental Health and Developmental Services, I didn't know that I would be in the midst of being a consumer of those services, but I was deputy director of this organization, and it was 1978, and I truly had no idea what I was doing. You can't imagine the complete gap of knowledge that I had to try to contribute to the operation of the organization. This organization was the recipient of NIMH grants, National Institute of Mental Health grants. The state wasn't involved. The feds here in Boston would select community mental health agencies from around the region and around the country to receive staffing grants and operation grants, they were called, and you just got a check every month, and you ran the organization with that money. And it was a lot of money in the sense that the organization really didn't know what to do with all the money that it had. At the same time, it was running programs for people with developmental disabilities, and there was virtually no money. You had Title 20 money, which was 10 or 20 bucks a day to essentially babysit people with developmental disabilities. There was a little bit of counseling for people with addiction disorders of various types, primarily alcohol, and nothing else. People were put in hospitals or put in jail to detox, and that was pretty much what was done in that regard. For the most part, the police were the primary providers of mental health services to the most seriously mentally ill, because they basically gathered them up and drove them to Concord, New Hampshire, to the state hospital and dropped them on the doorstep there, and they typically were medicated pretty heavily, and they basically stayed there frequently for a long time. sometimes for what turned out to be a lifetime. We tried to change things. We did change things. So for example, our agency went to the New Hampshire Supreme Court and won a case that became precedent-setting for New Hampshire by law, but was used in many of the other states around the country, that essentially guaranteed that group homes for people with mental handicaps of certain types, that was the term that was used, could exist in residential areas, that you couldn't zone them out of residential areas. And that was something that hadn't existed. It was a right that didn't exist. People were put into commercial areas. There were a variety of ways that communities used to keep those people out of sight. And we won that Supreme Court case that became a precedent that was used throughout the country. And we built and created a number of those group homes and provided an option other than the state hospital or once-a-week counseling sessions. We ran sheltered workshops. That was the primary programming for people with developmental disabilities. They were interesting. So we had a contract with Delta Airlines to put the little foam doodads on the end of the headphones that you use for listening to movies. And people with developmental disabilities and people with severe mental illness that were in town, we threw them into the same program. The agencies didn't like that, but that's what we did. And they would put the little foam doodads on the end of that. They would also sort gloves, medical gloves. What's the stuff everybody's allergic to? Latex. They would sort the latex gloves looking for holes in the latex gloves. And the way sheltered workshops worked, an individual or 2 or 3 individuals without handicaps would work for an hour doing that, putting those things on, and they would measure how many they could do in an hour. And if they could do 100 in an hour, and if the minimum wage was $5, then you got a nickel for each one you put on. You got a piecework rate. So individuals with handicaps might be able to put 100 on or 200 on, or might be able to put 5 or 6 or 7 on, and might make a quarter or 30 cents an hour for the work that they were doing. That's how sheltered workshops worked. And this was the primary programming for adults with developmental disabilities. We just to add to that, I developed a real skill at trying to take the non-handicapped individuals who set the rates and made sure they were as slow as possible by making the job as difficult for them as possible, thereby increasing the rate that others were paid. But you come to find out, it took me a couple of years to find out, that we were taking the highest functioning, the most capable, the most productive individuals with developmental disabilities and people who could conceivably go to work in the community. And we wouldn't let them go because they were the ones we needed to get all the little doodads on the headphones. We needed them. We needed their productivity, and so we wouldn't let them out of the program. I'm maybe overstating it, but not very much. We kept them trapped. And so we began the placement of individuals who could work in competitive employment situations, created a job coaching system, and provided those folks with opportunities. We didn't do anything with regard to child and protective services. That wasn't really our charge, and nothing really was changing that way. Abuse was frequent. Teenage pregnancy was rampant. It was rampant because kids were drinking. It was rampant because they didn't have sex education. It was rampant because they didn't have access to birth control. But it was also rampant because the girls wanted to get out of the house and they got pregnant on purpose so that they could come up with an excuse to get out of abusive situations and out of abusive homes. And by rampant, I mean rampant. Teenage pregnancy was extremely common in this rural area and in America, but certainly in this rural area. I'm getting old and I don't want to miss any of the really exciting things I want to talk about, so I'm just going to take a quick peek here. The programming for people with developmental disabilities didn't really include much in the way of activities for daily living, but we had funding for partial hospitalization day treatment programs for people with mental illness. So we threw them all in together, rural area. We had 3 different locations, and we took folks who had severe and chronic mental illness and people with developmental disabilities, put them in the same program. It was funded all by the mental health side, and provided activities of daily living programming for both groups together. The regulators who would come visit and stuff were horrified that this was completely wildly inappropriate. It worked fine, it was not an issue. Substance abuse, no change. You went to the hospital or to jail, got detoxed, and then you'd have a little bit of counseling if you wanted it, and you were referred to AA for services there. So we made some progress. We made a dent. Things improved, but we didn't do enough. Nobody did enough, but we certainly didn't do enough. The world continued to change, though. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, and he decided that the direct funding of community mental health programs that started during the Kennedy era was an inappropriate thing for the federal government to do. We want to decrease the size of the federal government. We want to strengthen state governments. And so he created the block grant program. So for example, a state that might have $100 million worth of funding for community mental health centers in that state that went directly from the federal government to those agencies. Instead, they would first cut the amount, say to $80 million. They would send it to the state government. The state government needed to build a bureaucracy to manage it. There was no mental health bureaucracy in state governments in 1980. And so they would take another $10 million to hire a bunch of people and to run an operation at the state. So the mental health agencies in that state, instead of receiving $100 million in total, might receive $70 million. It was very, very disruptive and a very painful period, a very big decline in the funding for a relatively short period of time because where's Sarah? Raise your hand, Sarah. Creative Medicaid people around the country said, wait a minute, I've got an idea. And they said, let's take the $70 million in block grant money and let's use it as match for Medicaid money. And that's when Medicaid became the monster that ate mental health funding. And they realized that they could double their money, more or less. The feds would match in dollar for dollar, roughly, the amount of money that the states were putting in. So the states took their federal block grant money. They got 1115 waivers and other Medicaid waivers so that they could make their mental health programs Medicaid fundable, and the feds would then would match the $70 million that the state was putting into Medicaid funding with another $70 million from the feds. So it was really $140 million worth of federal money, and that would be the money that would fund mental health agencies. It became a fee-for-service operation, though. You went from having grants that let you create model programs. Instead, you had to come up with CPT codes, and you had to bill, and you had to do all those things. Also, the states said, wow, this is cool. I've got all this money, and I'm going to reduce state taxes and by stealing as much of that money as I possibly can. And they cooked up schemes, New Hampshire being among the most creative, to balance the state budget by grabbing much of that $140 million. So instead of it being a big boon, which it was for a little while, it started shrinking rapidly as the states used those match dollars to fund general state government operations, to reduce state taxes and so on. I say all this because this is a pretty radical change. Went from the funding of mental health programs, substance abuse programs, and to a degree developmental disabilities programs, excuse me, from being grant funded and limited by the creativity of the management of the agencies, of you folks, to being a fee-for-service medical model excuse me, operation that had to follow all the billing rules. And of course, that morphed into more billing of commercial insurance companies. It made the billing of sliding fee scales more inherent to operations, and you became medical billing operations in terms of the methodology for funding your organization. That was pretty radical. That was a significant change in the way things operate. The couple of other things changed. Ronald Reagan was one thing, but class action lawsuits were another. And the class action lawsuits that had already started in the mental health world that resulted in deinstitutionalization of people and resulted in courts ruling that you had to provide services in the least restrictive environment, they moved over into the developmental disabilities area, and those same court cases came to be. Places like the Laconia State School in New Hampshire shut down in an amazingly short period of time, about 48 months. From beginning to end, once a court master was appointed and said you had to shut this horrible place down. And they were pretty much all horrible places. Maybe some of you have examples that were wonderful, but I never saw any. The state institutions for developmentally disabled were horrible places, worse than the state psychiatric hospitals, if you could imagine. And so that was a big factor. Class action lawsuits were a big factor. Managed care, a little bit later on, came out. And the initial intent was that you folks would be on the hook. You would be at risk. You would take responsibility for all the individuals, Medicaid eligible individuals at least, in your particular catchment area, term you don't hear much anymore, but the area you serve, and you would receive a flat rate. We'd move away from fee-for-service. You'd get a flat rate, and if you kept them out of the state hospital, you won. And if you could do it for less money than it cost you, you won. And that was the money that you had available. It didn't work. And so managed care on a per provider basis was a failure. And for years, a few years, Echo ran in hoops trying to help you figure out how to negotiate managed care contracts specific to your agency. And of course, managed care in mental health became something that occurred at the insurance company level. As insurance companies bid on flat amounts, you know, $250 million, we will pay all the bills for the provision of mental health services to Medicaid recipients in your state, and we will manage that for you, and we'll manage approvals and authorizations for the providers in the state. And basically, they became intermediaries who were motivated to hold back on paying you. They didn't want to pay you. They got to keep the money if they could pay you as little as possible. And we entered into and continue to be in a period in which you are frequently at war with a managed care provider. Depends on the state you're in, but it's a constant battle to get paid, and they are highly motivated, dollar for dollar motivated, to both not pay you and to pay you as slowly as possible so that they can use their investments and generate revenue from those investments. And so that's largely the world we continue to live in. During that period, we worked hard at Echo to try to, this is an anecdote and I'm going to run out of time, but could you hand me my phone so I know what time it is a little bit here? But we would, oh, there's no chance. You're staying here. Forget that 10 o'clock thing you wanted to go to. We worked very hard to try to figure out how agencies could predict long lengths of stay and how better to manage the lengths of stay of the clients that you serve, because in a managed care environment, you wanted to get rid of them if you were the ones on the hook for the cost of those individuals. We did a fair amount of research, and I would travel around to agencies typically a year after they first implemented and they had a lot of data, and I would meet with them, and it was very interesting. Sure, people with schizophrenia, people with, at the time, major affective disorder, bipolar disorder, typically had fairly long lengths of stay. But those people also disappeared. They went into state hospitals, they moved, they got on buses, they stopped coming into the agency. So they were really a mixed bag in terms of length of stay. The best predictor nationwide of long lengths of stay in community mental health centers during that period of time were young, under 40-year-old female clients with college degrees seeing male clinicians. Best predictor, male clinicians like seeing female, young, educated clients, and they were the ones who stayed the longest period of time. That was the kind of data that our customers and some of you folks didn't particularly want to see, but it was perhaps helpful information for you to find out. It created a level of cynicism on my part, but probably not warranted. We weren't paying those clinicians very much. They had to find their joy as they could, I guess. Then something happened that changed particularly the family and children's services world, and it was cocaine. And I don't really know how to talk about cocaine here without heading into various realms that are not specific to my topic today, but you had both crack cocaine and you had powder cocaine, and it just took over America in the late 80s and into the 90s. And you had a racial element to it, where the punishments for the trafficking of crack cocaine were enormously greater than for powdered cocaine. The amount of frequency and duration of jailing of black men, as a general rule, was enormous compared to the jailing of white men who were perhaps more engaged in the powder cocaine world. But whether it was powder cocaine or whether it was crack cocaine, it destroyed families. Didn't kill people at the same pace as opioids do today, but it was spectacularly successful at destroying families. All of a sudden, you had this huge influx of children who were victims of abuse and neglect, not doubling, but tripling and quadrupling the number of horrible things that occurred, the newspaper headlines, the television reporting, the number of dead children, the number of horribly abused children. It was rampant throughout our population. It didn't matter color of skin or anything, but cocaine was a big, big factor in that. And the result was a pretty quick changeover where the orphanages that had largely been emptied out because people didn't have lots of extra babies and other people wanted babies, they were emptying out. They became residential facilities, and then other residential facilities were created, and America suddenly had hundreds of thousands and then a few million children who were very difficult to place. The severity of the abuse and neglect they'd experienced had made their behaviors very difficult to manage, and many of those kids were placed in these residential programs. Others were placed in foster care programs, and foster care programs, because there were disasters there, there were horrible scandals and horrible examples of abuse of kids in foster care. The recruitment, the training, and the monitoring of foster families started to become professionalized, and we started to change how society, the level of society's commitment to the care and treatment and service to our children and the children who'd been victims of abuse and neglect. And so after a bunch of years in which very little happened, the horror of cocaine was really the necessary change agent that resulted in the development of a child protective system in America that is enormously better than it was. And the teacher is much less likely to be afraid to call the home because the kid is going to get beaten. The girl is much less likely to pursue getting pregnant because she wants to get out of the home. Real progress in that regard in America. So where are we today? And I guess I have to move forward a little bit. But by the way, before I do though, here's an opportunity. Does anybody want to say, oh, George, you really got it wrong? That's just your personal 50-year perspective on this stuff. You just twisted and you got it wrong, and I'm going to tell you what the real thing is. Larry, you're the only one here old enough to remember any of that stuff.
You're very close.
I'm close, okay. That's definitely the best you're going to get from Larry. So let me keep my piece of paper because I don't want to miss anything particular. Actually, before I do, so I have to tie it a little bit into the software. Other than marketing, people will yell at me if I don't have some software here. And normally I'm showing you features and software, and so I wanted to get this off my chest. I wanted some of you to hear. So where are we today in the political environment? What are the driving forces? And like cocaine, negative stuff seems to me to be the driving force towards progress. So for example, homelessness. I have a daughter who lives in Portland, Oregon. Drive around Portland, Oregon, big homeless camps. People don't want to live near homeless camps. People don't want to shop near homeless camps. And they're big homeless camps. Other cities, plenty of other cities, not many quite like Portland, but plenty of other cities have that experience. The people who the police used to keep hidden, who made sure no one saw them, they don't do that anymore. Certainly not in Portland, Oregon. Police have given up policing as a general rule. And that's good. We're seeing the folks who are suffering from addiction, who are suffering from severe and chronic mental illness. We're seeing grown-up and kids who are victims of abuse and neglect. We're seeing people with developmental disabilities, and they're visible, they're in front of us. And I use homelessness as a marker for all of that, but they're just not hidden away the way they were in the past. Those folks are in front of people. People don't like that. People don't want to see that. And people are willing to ask their politicians to fund programs that'll clean up their streets. They'll get those people out of sight. Now, the motivations might not be completely pure, but the end result can well be funding. Boy, am I cynical. I sure sound cynical. But it might well be funding that can make a real difference. Guns. A lot of people, a lot of politicians don't want to restrict guns, but people are dying all the time. We have big shootings, and 30, 40 plus thousand people a year die in those shootings. And roughly daily, there is what is defined as a mass shooting occurring in America. And so what's the solution to that? Well, if you're not going to take away guns, which would eliminate the problem, then let's call it a mental health problem. Let's cure people with mental health, or let's at least identify them. Let's mark them up so that we can keep guns out of their hands. The politics of it and the rationale of it and all that, I'm going to leave to you folks to decide. I don't have enough time, but it's going to bring us funding. Everybody, Republicans and Democrats, are going to vote for mental health funding if it means fewer mass shootings. And that's another example of a negative that maybe will lead to a positive, and is in the process of leading to a positive. Policing. Body cameras, telephones, we are able to watch bad policing occur. We don't see lots and lots of good policing. I am a big fan of a great many police officers that I have grown close to over the years, and all that, but there are some bad policemen and women, and they hurt people inappropriately. And we see examples of that on television more or less every night. Some of it's race-based, some of it is simply incompetence on the part of police. It's simply their fears that they have. But in any case, the ability of police to manage individuals with florid mental health symptomology is not very good. And it's true of substance abuse. It's true of developmental disabilities situations as well. We've seen examples of all those occurring. And how do we fix policing? And we probably, we need to do better training, we need to do better monitoring, et cetera, but our police need the help of clinical professionals. How do we get clinical professionals attached at the hip to to policing, and Grand and My Care, and you'll be hearing more about that during the course of the next couple of days. A final area is that integrated care and providing better health care, general health care, to people with intellectual and disabilities and mental health problems and addiction problems. People are living longer, even with some pretty severe disabilities. And their parents are getting old and dying off. And so we have this whole political force of parents who are obligated, feel an obligation, a commitment, a love for their children, and want to make sure their adult children are going to be living in decent situations after they're gone, after they're no longer able to provide some care to their children. And so the need for residential options and supportive living options for older people with a variety of behavioral health disabilities is clear, and you have a political force of aging parents who are advocates for that. Another example of a difficult situation potentially leading to improvements, at least in the area of options for adults with developmental, mental health, addiction issues that they're confronted with. Just going to take a minute, and I am going to show you pictures of a couple of things. That's me. I'm on the board of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests right now. So if you're driving around, you're looking at a tree, that's me. I don't know why I said that. Empowering our partners to be clinically effective and financially strong. That's what we're here for. As long as we remember that in all of our decision making, we do a good job running ECHO. So this is getting old. This is the oldest part of EchoVantage, is the visual health record, because we had it in clinician's desktop in a slightly different form. So one of your votes, if I were you, would be an update to this to make it even better. But it serves an important role, and that role is that the model for mental health services in particular, and addiction counseling services in particular, those two, gee, let's have a scheduled appointment, and you come in for that appointment and you see me, and that's the only time you get your services, is probably not the future if policing is going to be supported, if we're going to address gun issues. And we need to be available 24/7 to respond to that kind of stuff. And that means we're going to have clinical staff who are unfamiliar with the individual at 3 o'clock in the morning who's having a big problem. And if we're going to help the cop or the emergency room or whomever, the family member, or the individual, him or herself, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the individual who is on duty at that point needs to be able to quickly get up to speed on what's going on with this client. And the ability to quickly see what's happening in a client's life is an important and essential component. What needs to be done as far as updating this to make that even more jump out at you? That's going to become more and more important. It is important now, it's going to become more important. Residential programming. So the ability to find the right bed in the right room with the right roommate in the right building or the right house or the right location or with the right clinical staff, that's going to be more and more important as well. Goodness knows we need, particularly for addiction services, completely underserved with regard to living options, integration with domestic violence programs, as well as children who've been victims of abuse and neglect, and finding the right bed for them to sleep in and the right place for them to live, and making sure this tool set that we have in EchoVantage around residential programming and searching for the best possible placements, understanding what the waiting lists are, understanding who's on that waiting list and what the characteristics and needs of those individuals are, that's a big deal. The join telemedicine session. Yeah, telemedicine has to be completely integrated. You have to be able to click on a button and get right to a video with the police officer on site, certainly with the client, with family members, with the hospital, ER team. That has to be seamless. And our ability to make that seamless is incumbent upon us. I love this picture. This is a picture from Mend, but I'm curious, at some point I'll ask, but how many people actually do group therapy on video sessions? I think it's pretty rare, but I'm curious about that. I think it's very rare. Wow, there's even more going on here. And they're so happy. Do your clients look that happy on their telemedicine? And they're good looking. Wow. How many of these pictures did you stick in here? Holy mackerel. Okay. Communicating via text, communicating the status of medications, medication reminders, communicating clinician to client using technologies other than your voice. The client portal has to be responsive to that and has to help you manage all that stuff. This is from the grand treatment plan, and I'm not going to go into it in detail because they are in a session that will start, I think today, right? Shortly. Anybody know? Today? I'm sorry. Wednesday. Okay, stick around. That one's really important. I'm going to go through all the pictures again. But going from a system oriented towards a scheduled service, and at the end of that scheduled service, going to the treatment plan and marking up the treatment plan with what was addressed and creating a progress note. Great, absolutely got to do that. That has to be there. But flipping that on its head, whether you're going to a non-fee-for-service, completely outcome-oriented reimbursement system as CCBHCs and others in negotiations are creating models for, it's got to be able to work the other way. You have to be able to say, gee, I didn't have any appointments scheduled. I didn't schedule it up front. I simply came into contact with this individual when this individual needed me. That person's treatment plan is right in my face. I'm working off of that treatment plan to see what needs to be addressed, what I'm working on. The progress note comes from that. And if necessary, the billing piece that comes out the other end, the fact that I spent 1 hour and did this CPT code, that comes out of it automatically on the back end. That's flipping it on its head. That's another direction that we need to be able to provide as an option to you. Maybe it won't be what everyone switches to tomorrow, but that has to be one of the directions we go. And that focus on the outcome of treatment, that focus on the plan, but where we're going jointly with that client to make that client's life better, that's where this focus has to be. And that's what this revision and this customization does. And then you got to report on all this stuff. And Kelly Stapora is here somewhere. If you haven't met her, you must. She's all the way in the back by the door. You can't get out without saying hi to her. She lives in Austin, Texas. She's got the most lovely accent. Just makes you a little hard at Texas. You feel like Willie Nelson's in the other room. But she knows her numbers. And she's a PhD researcher in behavioral health and social services, and she's smart. And a group of you work with her in her Data Science Alliance, coolest name of anything Echo has ever created. And the ability to look at the data that drives what your goals are. What are you trying to accomplish? We can't decide that for you. You have to decide. We can provide you, and Kelly and team have provided hundreds and hundreds of ways to look at the information you have in our clinical and financial software. But you've got to know the questions to ask. and we can provide suggestions and guidance, etc. And certainly Kelly can. But boy, you have to say, I've got all this information now. It's all in my EchoVantage system, and I need to construct the questions that I need to ask that get me to the outcomes and the results that I want to have for the clients that my agency serves. And I don't have any more time. I'll just finish by saying we had to do this a few months ago, and I asked Alan, and they made up a number because I asked them how many people Echo's customers, you folks, have served since Echo's founding 40 years ago. And I can tell you, not exactly what the number is, but I can tell you that 5 million would be a conservative number. The number of children who've been victims of abuse and neglect, the number of individuals dealing with addiction, people with chronic and severe mental illness of all type, people with intellectual and other developmental disabilities. Over 5 million people have been served by you folks. We don't do anything. Echo doesn't do anything. Our job is just to help you make a difference in people's lives. And the fact that we, however indirectly, have touched those 5 million lives is really important to me. My cynicism about the bumps in the provision of behavioral health care services to America throughout my presentation here is not a reflection of giving up or anything like that. It rather is a very bumpy ride, but it has moved forward in all respects in each of those 4 areas with all of those 5 million plus people. They're getting better services today, more sensitive services, more responsive services than they did 50 years ago. And I'm so glad you're here, and I thank you so much for what you do. Thank you. Thank you. I am supposed to answer questions. I have no time to do that. Is that accurate? Oh, I do. I have time either for 4 questions or 4 minutes. So if you ask one question, I'll answer it for 4 minutes. I promise. It's easy for me to do that. Anything you want to ask or any comment you want to make? Then I'll let you go get some more tea and coffee. Thank you very much. I'll be around if you want to chat for the rest of today, or at least part of today. Thank you.